Folks, how lucky we are to have this esteemed panel with us this evening. Four really very successful and engaged civic leaders who have power well beyond their physical jurisdictions and from very different backgrounds and experiences that I'm sure you're aware, or soon will be if Google can assist you. Now, let's get stuck in, panel. I know you're going to be very engaged with each other as well as with our audience through any online questions that come through. I'm going to do my absolute best to be provocative today. It is unlike me, uncharacteristic. It'll be a really big effort, and I'm going to need your help, obviously. But I'm going to start really with the JFK quote that our very thoughtful sponsors, JLL, brought to us this morning, and that is, "We will neglect our cities to our peril, for in neglecting them, we neglect the nation." And against that benchmark, I guess I've got a two-part question to kickstart us. The cities deals, as we heard at lunchtime from Minister Tudge, seem to have really gathered some momentum. What do our panel think? Are we doing enough for our cities nationally, including our regional cities? And what would you personally change about city deals if you could? And I might start down the end with you, Anna.
Sure, thanks Mike, thanks for the question, and hello to everyone. I was elected in November and I saw the draft of the city deal that, our city deal is with 4 councils, so the capital but also the 4 Greater Hobart councils. And there were a couple of new mayors and we saw the draft and we weren't very impressed, I've got to say. The cities actually weren't particularly involved in the drafting. It was actually much more of a state and federal conversation, and I think that's the problem. It's missing all of the knowledge and on-ground information that cities actually bring to city deals. So we put a bit of work into it and we were told, oh, rush, you must get this done, we must get this done by Christmas. And we just tried to refocus it a bit on the things that we thought were important, things like public transport, which we don't have much of in Hobart, and affordable housing. But yeah, the process was poor. The actual final city deal we saw was the night before it was launched. We were the secret big package items we didn't know of until 4 p.m. the night before it was actually announced, and they were $450 million to do up the Antarctic bases in Antarctica, which Hobart is Australia's capital of Antarctica, but we're not quite in Antarctica. So we weren't particularly impressed with that. So look, we signed it. We said we were fairly positive about it. It's got some good words in it that we feel happy to collaborate together with the state and federal government, but we felt it was a little bit superficial.
We need to do a lot more with city deals. We've seen from other jurisdictions around the world that they can be effective if they're used properly. The main purpose of city deals, our understanding, is to really drive productivity, and yet in the 2 biggest cities in Australia where we can drive so much in terms of positive productivity outcomes, we don't have a city deal. So we think there's huge scope. We're actually talking about ways in which we can coordinate to nicely advocate and lobby to our federal government colleagues about this, because we know across the capital cities in Australia it represents about 80% of the population and 80% of the nation's GDP, and we really feel that our capital cities should have city deals that are based on how to drive productivity outcomes. And those tests have gone, they've become very marginal seatised. It's become very political, the discussion around them, and we've got examples of how they come together. And but as a mechanism, we know they can work, but I think there's a lot of work to do to make sure that they do have the positive outcomes they're supposed to.
Andrew.
I'd just begin by agreeing with my colleagues here that really, when you look at Parramatta, for instance, we are growing at 3.9%. I'm going to have some 15,000 new workers, part of our Parramatta Square package. We have made an enormous commitment in holding 3 hectares of land by our station for 20 years, and that is now paying big dividends. But when I look at the Western Sydney rail line, it's now at 145% capacity. And for me, it is really all about transport, schools and delivering those services. If you go to Parramatta, you can see that we're not frightened of density, but we are very frightened of the quality of life that we've got to have. So a little bit of planning in advance, preparing places for new schools and new transport networks would be very good, and that should be driven in part by the federal government.
Thank you, Andrew. Clover.
Hi everyone, nice to be here. I think given the majority of people in the world now are living in cities, and in Australia it's about 75–80%, that it's absolutely critical that the national government has a policy for those places which are the key drivers of the economy, and that's what our cities are, of course. It was really disappointing, I think, when the Abbott government were in Canberra, a number of Lord Mayors, and we were told, no, we don't have an urban policy, which I thought was really quite extraordinary. Subsequently, the coalition government came up with a proposal for city deals. That's a way of saying we've got an urban policy. Well, that's great, but I think it's really important that the federal government works with the state government and local government, city government, to identify what projects are most needed and how each level of government can work cooperatively to get an outcome on a really important project for a city. I think that's really critical. It shouldn't be based on marginal seats. It should be based on good policy and need. And I think that's what we want to drive.
And what do you make, I think, and we'll keep this brief, but I think I would ask you, what do you make of the relative progress, I guess, over the last 5 years? I mean, we started with Townsville. I think we can all agree that was just a stadium with the word city deal appended to it. But there has been a quite rapid increase in the sophistication of some of this, and notwithstanding some of the governance issues around which levels of government are being appropriately brought in, it seems to be that this increasing level of sophistication holds more promise than the original couple of projects that got off the ground. And certainly when you look at South East Queensland, that's quite a large-scale, very coordinated model. What would you reflect in?
Well, we haven't had an experience in the global city, but I know Western Sydney has had some success where the council's worked with the Greater Sydney Commission and the federal government, and they have got a really good deal there, and I think that's the way it should work.
Okay. So I'm going to take some of these questions now, and then I'm going to come back to a couple of the other ones which I promised our panel. Maybe I've got a better way of framing this one, because we did have a great discussion earlier in the day about YIMBYs. How do we turn people into yes in my backyard? And that's got something to do with all the people in this room and something to do with the people on the stage. The question itself is, how can government and industry collaborate to push back against the increasingly ferocious anti-growth discussion occurring on social media, which is often very misinformed? I probably prefer to put it, what are your tips for our glorious-looking audience here today about how to create a YIMBY mindset in populations, and how are you guys positively preparing to harness population growth? I might start with you, Clover. Yes.
We've successfully increased our densities in key areas of our city. Yes, there was pushback, a bit of pushback at the beginning, till I talked through with those communities why we should do it. And I'll just give you briefly why I think we should be increasing densities. Currently, we have accelerating global warming and we have accelerating population increase. Now, these are two reasons why we can't afford to continue the urban sprawl, and we can't afford to develop our food basin, because food supply is going to be a very important issue for us in the future too. And so we need to talk about the costs of continuing the urban sprawl, whether the economic costs of having to provide transport and communication to those areas, where it's you have the increase in the environmental impact of increasing numbers of people on roads, in congestion, paying toll fares, where you have social isolation of people in far-flung suburbs, and then talk about the advantages of living in higher density areas closer to the city. It's proximity for a start, where you can be close to where you work, you can be close to schools, you can be close to sporting facilities, cultural facilities, close to the buzz, where you break down social isolation because people bumping into each other on beautifully provided streets by council, in parks, in coffee shops, at community facilities provided by council, and where you have councils that provide beautiful streets, great parks, great facilities, and have controls that provide well-designed, sustainable apartments, and you have federal and state government supporting with adequate transport and educational health facilities, it all comes together. But again, it's a matter of the three levels working together. But we have had success in the city. We have our Harold Park development's been very successful. Our Green Square development, where 30,000 people already moved in, is a successful project. And also the Ashmore estate. We identified those former industrial and sporting sites as areas where urban renewal could go, much higher densities. And we're on that journey, and yes, we want the state to be more involved in terms of providing the things they need to do in terms of transport and schools. And I think, federal government should be looking at those city deals where they could support affordable housing, because that's the thing that we're really missing in all of this in our cities. But I think urban density can be a really great place to live if those levels of governments work together and create it. And really, we have no alternative, and I think that's what people need to understand too, with the sorts of challenges we've got about where people are going to live and how we're going to address accelerating climate change.